What if no one helps Minnesota's most vulnerable children?
We're creating a lost generation of children who don't have the basic building blocks to succeed as adults or to participate normally in society.
What is abuse?
There's two basic categories, abuse and neglect. Often people think neglect is not as serious, but it can be very serious because if children are neglected when they're very little, then their brains don't develop normally, just as in, say, the Romanian orphanages. Abuse takes many forms, including sexual abuse. A typical example would be a mother hits her child with a 2x4 and breaks her arm, goes to the hospital reports it.
Is the damage to the child permanent?
When children are abused, particularly when they're very young, they suffer traumatic kind of experiences that impair their ability to develop normally. And so that means that children don't develop skills like ability to pick up on social cues. They lose IQ over time as they're being traumatized, and they don't grow as well as other children. And so the impact of trauma on children's development is extreme, particularly when they're very young.
What does that mean for the rest of us?
Well, there's a financial cost, which is roughly $210,000 per child over a lifetime of child abuse. And so if you take a couple thousand children a year, that's we're incurring over $400 million in lifetime costs every year from the kids that we don't see. And then in terms of social costs, these are the children who don't behave well in school, they get kicked out of school, they end up not completing their education. There's a high rate of kids then becoming criminals, and then the pattern repeats itself as they get older and get married and have their own children.
Minnesota's abused children need help. Just how bad has the response been?
Minnesota is only seeing 25 to 30% of children who are abused compared to over 60% nationally. And this is partly because the state has cut its contribution repeatedly to child protection over the last 10 years by 25 million. And we're now the second or third lowest state in the country in terms of how much the state contributes to child protection.
How many children are affected?
Every year, Minnesota gets around 60,000 reports of child maltreatment, and we respond to about 17,000. If we were a typical state, we'd respond to another 23,000 children every single year. And then once we finally do respond, and it may take 3, 4, 5 reports, then most of those children don't get service anyway. Over 70% of them don't even get service. They go back out the door, and then the churning starts all over again. More reports, more kids who aren't seen. They get in the system, they aren't served, they go back out again.
What happens to these vulnerable children once they're caught up in the system?
The average child that finally gets into the court system where they start to get services and be treated seriously gets placed 4 times. And in addition, while they're actually under the court supervision, almost 80% of them are abused again while they're under protective supervision of the court. And then finally, when the cases are completed, 29% of those cases, the kids are sent back to settings where they have the same risk and the same problems as when they first came into the system.
Can the Minnesota system be fixed?
This system has to be revamped in major ways before it's going to function for kids. But fortunately, there are ways that are known and can work. For example, there are a lot of well-researched, evidence-based best practices that are able to prevent abuse, even in fairly significant, fairly serious cases. That are known to work. So the key thing is to invest in evidence-based practices, well-researched, replicate them with high fidelity to what's worked elsewhere, and invest as much as possible in the earliest possible intervention.
Who is working to change the system?
Here in Minnesota, Safe Passage for Children is the main advocacy group that is working on this issue, but we have a number of partners who are very interested in improving the situation for abused and neglected children. And they include school social workers, people who are called guardians ad litem, who work in the court system on behalf of children, the County Attorneys Association, groups like that. The way that we find it breaks out is that people who are managing the systems think the system is working well, and they will present it well, and you would think that you were in Sweden if you were talking with them. But if you're talking to people trying to interact with the system, you would think you're in Haiti. So part of our goal is to try to get these groups together to have a common conversation so that we can begin to work on the problem.
What makes Safe Passage so effective?
One of the things that makes Safe Passage effective is that we don't get any money from the state or the counties, and so we're free to raise issues that others who are working in the field have more difficulty with because they're providing direct service and using state and county money. Another reason Safe Passage is effective is because we're volunteer-based. Our volunteers often are people who have worked with the child protection system and are concerned about what's going on, so there's a lot of energy behind their commitment. The other key point with our volunteers is that they can almost always get in to see their elected officials because they're constituents of their state representative or state senator. And that has gotten us access to people that we otherwise might not be as able to see. And they're not paid lobbyists, so they have a lot more credibility. So this is a citizen participation model that's very lean in terms of cost structure, but very effective in terms of getting access to political opinion makers.
What can you do to help?
Immediate things that volunteers can do include signing up for our e-brief, which is a weekly policy piece, and then they can retweet that or share it with friends and neighbors. Obviously, donate funds. And the key thing is to volunteer time to go down to the legislature with us and meet with elected officials and talk about the concerns. Safe Passage for Children is advocating for a groundbreaking agenda. We want to measure objectively every child who comes into the child welfare system to see if the system is helping them to do better or worse. And this will help us move back into the leadership position that Minnesota enjoyed 10 years ago in child welfare. But more importantly, it's urgent because we need to help children in Minnesota who are victims of child abuse and neglect now and not 10 years from now.